This issue now to our panel to talk more about Ontario's sexual education fallout. Joining me now on this discussion in Toronto is Adam Goldenberg. He is an adjunct law professor at the University of Toronto. Also in Toronto is Brittany Andrew Amofa. She is the policy and research manager at the Broadband Institute. And in Montreal, we have National Post columnist Barbara Kay. She is joining us via FaceTime. And Barbara, I think your connection's okay, so let's get to this. Adam, I want to start with you. This is all about the kids and the concerns that are being raised as to whether or not they're going to be negatively affected by this change to the curriculum. So what are your thoughts? Will the children of Ontario be negatively affected?
Yes, significantly, profoundly, and for a lot of them permanently. Look, I took sex ed in school around 1998, which is when this new old curriculum was introduced, which is before Google, before Facebook, before the iPhone, before kids could download high-speed porn videos on their cell phones late at night when their parents have gone to bed, which is the reality of life in 2018. Look, I was a closeted gay kid in high school, and I can tell you the exact situation, the exact scene in that classroom, the one and only time the teacher mentioned being gay in my sex ed class. And it very well may have saved me from never having encountered that anywhere else, because I wasn't going to talk to my parents about it. I wasn't out to them. And the difference that that made in my life 20 years ago, to think now that young people would be deprived a thoughtful and consistent approach to issues like sexual orientation, gender identity and expression in a world where this is a reality, scientific, social, cultural, is so ignorant, so backward, and so potentially harmful to thousands of young people across Ontario. It really is a disgraceful move by the Conservative government here.
Brittany, when you heard that this was going to be repealed, what did you think?
When I heard this was going to be repealed, what I thought was that social conservatives are going to have a strong voice within this PC government, and that Doug Ford is willing to play up to that base, even though they're a very small minority of our province's population. So throughout the entire election, we saw controversy around some of the candidates that were affiliated with the PC party, talking about the sex ed curriculum. We also saw controversy around potentially rolling back women's rights in regards to reproductive rights and abortion, etc. So all these things kind of fall underneath the same umbrella. So it's actually quite concerning, but it's quite, I would say he's quite consistent with his message. And he had stated that he was going to scrap the sex ed curriculum, which was extremely unfortunate. I agree with everything that Adam has said, but it also speaks volumes in terms of the strength of the social conservative faction within the PC party.
Barbara, what about you? Do you agree that the current sex education program should remain?
No, I don't like parts of the current program. I'm sorry that this program is going to be repealed and sent back to an earlier time without reworking it. I would have liked to see it repealed but reworked from the ground up. There are elements of the sex ed curriculum, especially in the very early grades, that I have a problem with. I have a problem with a lot of the ideology behind the architecture of the sex ed curriculum. The architect of the sex ed curriculum in Ontario was a person whose personal character and psychology turned out to be so terrible.
Oh, come on.
That alone would have warranted a total revamp of the curriculum to make sure that elements of that ideology or whatever, we're not getting into it. My concern is with the very early grades, learning things that kids aren't ready for, learning it in a slanted way, and also I agree that there's very little about love, commitment, waiting, deferring gratification, marriage as an ideal, that sort of thing, alternatives to abortion. So I think that when kids are not at the age where they can assess critically what they're listening to, I would have liked to see a lot of more attention paid to what kids are learning, especially about gender identity, which is ideologically based in the early grades.
Adam, I know you want to weigh in, but I just want to, picking up on Barbara's point here, the fact that I think there are those out there who have problems with the age in which things are being introduced. And as we discussed, across the country, it is different depending on the province you live in. I want to play a clip from the Doug Ford campaign trail.
For too long, the Liberals have ignored Ontario parents. They have introduced a sex curriculum based on ideology, a curriculum that teaches very sensitive topics starting at an early age.
So here's the thing. No surprise that this might have come, because it is what he campaigned on, one of his promises. But why repeal? And this maybe can go, Adam, to you. The fact that he's repealed it 20 years versus having maybe done a more measured look at this and changed smaller things or more intricate details to it rather than just go back and just flip the page.
So the reason is because it takes time to come up with a new curriculum, and this government wanted to show its social conservative supporters that it was going to do what it told them it was going to do right away. And they're doing it at the expense of kids who, even Barbara concedes, are being taught a curriculum, or going to be taught a curriculum, that is woefully out of date and totally inadequate. Let me just address something that Barbara said, though, because she made reference to the guy who oversaw the sex ed curriculum, who had some sexual practices that were questionable. She's talking about a guy called Ben Levin. Ben Levin was the Deputy Minister of Ontario at one point during the Liberal time in power. He was convicted of child pornography charges. Ben Levin did not write the sex ed curriculum. Experts wrote the sex ed curriculum. Parents were consulted. At least one parent representative from every single school in Ontario was consulted about the previous sex ed curriculum, and teachers who, unlike most parents, let's admit it, parents don't know how to teach their kids as well as teachers know how to teach their kids about algebra, about science, and yes, about sexual education. So this argument that because Ben Levin was in a position of power in the Ministry of Ontario, in the Ministry of Education in Ontario, the entire sex ed curriculum is suspect is ridiculous. And when advocates against sexual education, progressive sexual education, use that argument, it betrays the frailty of the reasoning behind their position. This age appropriateness question, yes, parents are going to be uncomfortable with kids learning, some parents, about the correct names for their anatomy at young ages. But the reality is that as long as kids...
I don't think anybody, nobody is against
no,
that.
It's about learning that gay kids exist and that transgender kids exist.
That is not the issue.
It's about learning about consent, though, right?
That they're
That's
learning
a problem
more
to
than
you.
No.
What are they learning, Barbara? What's the problem?
With biology.
One thing that I would like to say is that absolutely that this will be at a huge detriment to our children's lives, to people who are striving and working towards creating an inclusive and equitable society. This takes us 10 steps backwards. What needs to happen now is that there needs to be mass public education campaigns. And I do think, just to kind of bring into context what occurred in terms of the lead up to implementing the new sex ed curriculum, I do think the Liberal government could have done more to engage with people on the ground, to let people know what was happening, to prep people for these changes. And maybe this backlash wouldn't be so intense right now. But what needs to occur is that people need to understand that a sex ed curriculum is necessary in order for healthy development, in order for children to make wise decisions. We're living now in an internet era where access to information is infinite. And so even this information can be conflicting, wrong information. So for those to sit there and to be happy that the sex ed curriculum is no longer existing is at the direct detriment of our children and youth.
So Barbara, you made the point that you don't actually want to see the curriculum go back to 20 years ago, and I don't want to date Adam and I, but I think we might have been in high school at the same time, because I remember that curriculum, and it involved not a lot of the language that apparently is in the curriculum currently.
Like the word consent.
Yeah.
No,
I
would very much like to see a 2018 curriculum, but without ideology. And
what
when
ideology?
Adam says that,
what ideology?
So let's let Barbara talk. Barbara, how would you see this curriculum put together?
I would like to see, first of all, I'd like to see the whole gender identity program, which is put together by ideologues, because it is based entirely in theory and not in science. I would like science to be taught to the kids, and biology. I don't think many parents would object to very young children learning about biology, I think that's great. And they should know the names of the parts of their body, and they should know how babies are conceived and all that. But that's rooted in real science. Gender identity expression right now with the genderbread charts, all that, that whole social construction, gender fluidity thing is total ideology and harmful to children. It encourages doubt. It normalizes an affliction. It normalizes an affliction that is rare. Gender dysphoria is not a common thing. And
so is being gay.
Although,
like, this is how people used to talk about homosexuality,
Adam,
Barbara. This is exactly what people used to say about gay people.
6-year-old kids don't have to know about sexual desire in general. They should not be discussing sexual desire. They should know that some people have, most people have a mother and a father. Some people have two fathers. Some people have two mothers. That's all little kids have to know. They don't have to know about sexual desire and what happens. That can come later, and it should come later. And gender identity should absolutely be revamped, and most of it should be scrapped. That whole genderbread thing, it encourages doubt in children. It normalizes an affliction, and it actually tells children, hey, this could happen to you, but don't worry, it's totally okay. It is not okay to tell children that, because it plants seeds of doubts about their own genetic reality. And I think that is gaslighting children, and it's actually child abuse. It's mental child abuse and voyeuristic besides. I really, really would love to see that program mostly scrapped and not written by anybody when it does come up, written by real scientists and not by the ideologues and the trans activists who are presently writing those programs.
Adam, what's wrong with the idea of having, as Barbara calls them, real scientists involved in that, in formulating a curriculum if you're going to talk about gender identity?
Who do you think was involved in writing the last version of the curriculum? Science tells us...
It was not real scientists, no.
There is scientific consensus, Barbara, that gender is not a binary proposition. Everyone who knows...
There is no...
Yes, there
Adam,
is.
Adam,
Barbara,
there is
Barbara,
no gender...
No, you're wrong. You are simply wrong. There is consensus that gender is not a either-or option.
You are wrong.
Barbara, what you are advocating... Barbara, what you are advocating is an approach to pedagogy...
No, and all the studies show that gender is pretty binary.
It's wrong.
And that it is not
pretty binary.
fluid.
Pretty binary.
Their social construction is mostly a myth. And the fact that sex and gender are not linked, which is the basis of gender identity education now, is a total myth.
Sarah, let's remember what Barbara is talking about.
All credible science shows that they are completely linked, and any studies you're going to see to the contrary are not credible studies.
Oh, because Barbara says so. Look, Sarah, to go back to your original question, what Barbara is advocating and what the opponents of progressive sexual education are advocating is an approach to teaching kids that doesn't ever instruct young people that A, they may feel confused about their sexual or gender identity, that they may not identify as the sex in which they were born, which we know because people live these experiences and we can talk to them, that is a real thing, and science backs that position up. And what the sex ed curriculum,
gender dysphoria is real.
And what the sex ed curriculum does is it says that's not disorder, that's not wrong, that's not sickness, you are not unhealthy or something is wrong with you. You are a loved, valuable person who should be respected by society, including by your classmates.
You can have a disorder and still be loved, Adam.
Yes, and that's exactly what people used to say about gay people. You should go see your therapist to fix the gay in you.
And they still say it about gender dysphoria. And you know
5
why?
years from now, people like you won't be making this argument in public because it will sound as ridiculous to everyone as it sounds ridiculous to most of us already.
I think it's very clear.
It's 1 in 200 people, Adam, and it is wrong to tell children that this could happen to you and putting those ideas in their heads.
Barbara, that is your opinion, and I think it's fair that you need to own your opinion on this particular issue. And just because someone doesn't agree with your opinion does not mean that their claims are invalid. I think it's very clear that this is what the debate is going to be like over the next 4 years while Ford is in power, unfortunately. Also, what's very clear is that an updated sex ed curriculum is necessary. That's no ifs, ands, or buts. So that needs to be re-implemented back into the curriculum. How do we get there? That's going to take a lot of time, it's going to take a lot of advocacy, it's going to take organizing, and it's going to take the majority of Ontarians, the 60% that did not vote for this government, to come together and to have their voices heard. So we can't get lost in this conversation that only about 40% of people voted for this government. And they now have a majority government, and they're able to make these sweeping changes. So if we get back to thinking about how do we strategize in order to have this back into the curriculum, I think that's where the focus should be, because they're two really polarizing sides of this debate, unfortunately. And I think, Barbara, you're not hearing the fact that a lot of people, a lot of lives have been improved by this curriculum, and that needs to be taken into consideration rather than just your opinion.
And honestly,
I'm not saying that the whole curriculum is wrong. I'm not arguing that it needs to be updated, and I'm not arguing that all these things have to be taught. Everything has to be taught, but at the appropriate age, under the appropriate conditions,
okay, guys.
And absolutely based in real science. And I'm sorry that I still continue to disagree, Adam, with your suggestion that it is somehow settled science that gender is somehow gender and sex are not linked.
I'm so sorry, guys. We're going to have to go.
Yes, we will have to
leave
disagree.
It at that disagreement. But Brittany, you point out we're going to be talking about this at length over the next 4 years, and I'm sure we're going to have you all back on to talk about it some more. So thank you very much for what was definitely a spirited debate about sexual education in Ontario. Adam Goldenberg, adjunct law professor at the University of Toronto; Brittany Andrew-Mofa, policy and research manager at the Broadbent Institute; and Barbara Kay with the National Post joining us from Montreal. Thank you so much.
Thank
Have a
you.
good weekend.